We return to the Energon Universe once more, this time with the one original IP out of the bunch, Void Rivals. This one ironically debuted first as a way of introducing readers to this fresh new universe, yet I'm reviewing it third. Why am I doing this in such an odd order, you may ask? Well, I never actually intended on discussing the other EU titles until you fine gents and gentesses asked me to. This one's also interesting because it was only intended to be a mini-series like Duke and Cobra Commander, but was so successful that it's now been promoted to an ongoing, with 12, soon to be 13 issues out as of the time I'm writing this. With that being the case, I'm not going to go into too much detail since I've got twice the amount of issues to cover as I have with all the other Skybound comics up to this point. I will be discussing key plot points, so consider this your one and only spoiler warning. So, let's get into it, shall we? Our team for this space road trip is writer Robert Kirkman, the mind behind the Energon Universe to begin with, and the man responsible for scarring my entire generation with Marvel zombies. Oh yeah, he also wrote other stuff. The Running Corpses and Invisible, something like that. I don't know. Our artist is Lorenzo De Felici. I'm not familiar with his other work, but his other notable works include Oblivion Song, also written by Kirkman, and his own creator-owned book, Chroma, both at Image Comics, which I gotta say, these comics actually look really cool, and I might look into these down the line. His style took some getting used to, but I've grown to really enjoy the art. It fits the overall vibe of the book, and he sells the more fast-paced scenes perfectly. So, let's get into the plot. What exactly is Void Rivals all about? So, we start with, similarly to the first comic I reviewed in this continuity, two warring races, the Agorians and the Zertonians. Both sides are fighting over resources and control of their shared planetoid, which they call the Sacred Ring. Said planetoid was split into two sections at some point and now has a black hole in the middle, leading to their respective civilizations of Agoria and Zertonia. This fighting has gotten so bad that both sides are just barely scraping by, with the Zertonians resorting to capturing planetoids and comets just to keep their water rations from completely running out. Needless to say, tensions are quite high when an Agorian pilot, Darak, and a Zertonian warrior, Solilla, both end up crashing on the same desolate planet. Darak is what I can best describe as your average Chris Pine character, a relatively young hotshot who's quick with a joke and fancies himself a ladies' man but secretly cares a lot. Solilla is pretty much his polar opposite in every way that matters. She's a fierce warrior, focused on the mission and caring a great deal for honor. Kind of like Star-Lord and Gamora if I had to compare to other comic characters. So these two are our titular Void Rivals. Luckily neither of them are idiots and agree to work together pretty much immediately since it's either that or die stranded. And the last step to finishing their escape craft is to borrow a few components from their helmets, requiring them to do the most dishonorable thing one can do in either society: show the enemy their face. And to their mutual shock, neither had several sets of eyes or mouths or whatever other rumors have floated around over the years. They both happen to look exactly the same? Well, their forehead gems differ slightly, but this is what kickstarts the actual plot of the comic. The Sacred Ring and their peoples being split didn't just happen by accident out of the clear blue. That's something that'd need to happen on purpose. This also lines up with a vision Darak had while he was in stasis, showing the two sides being split and their need for reunification. Solilla sees this as a sign from her god Zerta, and just like that, they've got a sacred quest on their hands. They come up with this scheme to notify the leaders of their respective halves of the conspiracy that it turns out they were already aware of and are actively working to hide the truth on. Not that these two got all that far with it. Solilla knocks Darak out pretty much immediately after coming up with this plan. Enough about those two for now, we got a subplot to cover. So, a recurring character who's been popping up since issue 3 is someone who's also sporadically been appearing in the Transformers franchise since the G1 Transformers cartoon. This charming hunk of a man is Screw it, I'm just gonna call him Space Hog for the rest of this video. Our dynamic duo briefly run into Space Hog on their way to the Sacred Ring. They managed to trade up to a halfway decent Nebulan ship in exchange for their Frankenstein's monster of a spacecraft, which apparently has a unique alloy in it and he saw dollar signs, because he's got a wife and kids, you see. Remember, he's got a wife and kids to feed. Ever since then, we've gotten little interludes of him trying to pawn off this Quintesson prisoner he's been keeping around, but everyone he talks to keeps telling him to frag off. Aside from Transformers cameos, the main thing this amounts to is learning the Quintessons apparently have a vested interest in Zertonia. But back to our two musketeers. They get sprung out by a group of freedom fighters named the Unifiers who want the same thing they do, unifying the two peoples and the ring itself. hence the name. They get chased into the wastelands of Zertonia and have to deal with not only the elements, but the Zertonian military and their fiercest warrior Proximus, who is framed as something of a last resort doomsday weapon. Unleashing him on one's enemies is something even the two rulers fear having to do. Proximus pretty much annihilates these two with little effort, and they have to be rescued by the Autobot Springer. Speaking of, let's discuss our main antagonists for a minute. We don't have a story without someone to make life harder for these two. On the Zertonian half, we have their ruler Zazalak, a behemoth who appears to be just a brute but also has a genius tactical mind. This is someone who never does anything without calculating the risks, but can also crush you with his bare hands if he needs to. On the Agorian side, we have their chief minister and Darek's own father, Dulin. Dulin's generally pretty cold and stoic from the brief glimpses we get of him, so I can only assume his office is lined with Father of the Year awards. He seems to have nothing but contempt for his son. Whether or not he's done something to elicit this kind of cold rage, or if Dulin is just one of those parents, remains to be seen at this time. Last one I'd like to discuss is the aforementioned Proximus, basically the apex predator of the Zertonian Empire. He and Zalalac seem to have some kind of history, referring to some previous encounter which has him in his current condition, living in a life support tank as only a head and torso when he's not hunting someone. He's also heavily implied to be Solilla's little brother, albeit now with no memory of his former life. For right now, he gets by on cool factor. Look at this, he even chases them on a motorcycle. But out of all the antagonists we have so far, he's who I'm most interested to see fleshed out over time. Oh, by the way, it looks like Space Hog's wife left and took the kids. I feel like that's important to note. But back to our actual leads, and this is where I'm just gonna drop one last spoiler warning, because it's a lot of bombs all at once. Springer agreed to save Solilla's life after their near-death experience with Proximus, and he does it by infusing her with Energon? So yeah, this is where we start getting into the meat of it all, and when it dawns on me why this continuity is called the Energon Universe. So, Springer starts breaking it down with what he's learned. They're not mechanical, per se. Their biology does seem to be synthetic in nature, as if their entire race was created rather than something that evolved naturally. And to top it all off, those neat little gems they have on their foreheads aren't gems, they're Energon ports, which heavily implies that Agorians and Zertonians alike are all somehow Cybertronian in origin to some extent. He also makes mention of one Zerta Trion, Trion being the highest title one can achieve in Cybertronian culture, which may bring to mind another wise sage character in Transformers lore. This also lines up with the Quintessons being enemies with a Zerta Trion, who's so hated that even saying her name is met with instant execution. And to top it all off, the Sacred Ring isn't a natural formation. It was originally a machine used to generate Energon. So we end this part of the journey with Solilla and Darek's parting ways. She's going to search for Zerta Trion while he and the Unifiers on Agoria attempt to rally the people. So they touch gems and say goodbye, and what the frag is that? So when they touch gems, something in the Sacred Ring's black hole seems to wake up, only to go back to sleep when they part ways. So what is this seemingly planet-sized beast? We have nothing to go off of, but I have one main theory. But first, we'll get the obvious ones out of the way. My immediate thought seeing this was, is that frag Unicron? But no, this likely isn't Unicron. Despite looking like a planet and having green eyes, it doesn't really line up. Skybound has been sticking with the G1 designs, and what little we see here doesn't match either his robot mode or his planet mode. I've seen some speculation that this may be Solilla's god Zerta, but that also feels like a stretch. Zerta may or may not be Trion, is heavily implied to be more or less a normal Cybertronian, one of great power and knowledge, but still Cybertronian. So she'd be relatively huge, around Springer or Optimus Prime size, but not the size of an entire planet. What I think is going on here is the core of this entire conspiracy they're trying to expose. So occasionally we've seen Dulin and Zalalac speak of this legendary creature known as the Goliant. We know little of it, but it seems to be something both societies fear, and probably for good reason. I believe this thing is the Goliant. Splitting the Sacred Ring in two and trapping it in a black hole seems to be keeping it in stasis, which adds an interesting wrinkle to this little plot thread here. Despite the two rulers being pretty awful people in general, it seems they're continuing this lie and keeping the two peoples separately for a seemingly benevolent cause. If just one of each touching their gems together is enough to make it stir a little, then the entire race touching each other's gems would be like having 12 cups of coffee the minute you get out of bed. Which, if any of what we hear about the Goliant is remotely true, that could very well be an apocalypse level event for the Sacred Ring as a whole. But hey, just spitballing here, maybe Golion is just their culture's name for Unicron. Who knows? That'd be fun. Really, I only have a few noteworthy complaints, but nothing that seriously hampers the experience. Out of our two leads, Solila can get rather irritating at some points. While Darak is always trying to make the best out of the bad situation they're in, Solila is always complaining about it and either backstabs or skips out on Darak, which just makes things that much harder for both of them. All I'm saying is that one of these two feels way more committed to their shared goal and partnership than the other. My next notable complaint sounds relatively minor, but I find it just annoying enough to complain about. Space Hog here gets entirely too much page time here, and I find his subplot a little too irritating. So, his main contribution is tipping the Quintessons off to the Zertonians and that their enemy is still out there somewhere. And that's great. He served his purpose. But he's still sticking around and we keep checking back on him when that time could be devoted to developing something actually important. I like Shockwave, but we don't need to see Space Hog stroll on up and say hi only to be told to
Frag
off anyway. And even after serving his purpose, we still cut back to his apparent midlife crisis since apparently he doesn't have a wife and kids to feed like he claimed. I'm just not sure why he keeps popping up beyond maybe just Kirkman having a soft spot for that character. So, my last major complaint may seem a bit odd given what I review on this channel, but hear me out on this one. I feel like Void Rivals is the only comic in this universe that can't or doesn't want to stand on its own, and puts a little too much emphasis on connecting itself to Transformers. As a result, it feels more like a Transformers side quest rather than its own original story. Now, don't get me wrong. The stuff with Zerta Trion, the two cultures being split, and the looming threat of the Goliath, that stuff's all great. But you can count on one hand the amount of issues that don't have a Transformers character show up. Heck, Springer even shows up out of nowhere to bail them out and is now being presented as Darak's new partner going forward. Stuff like Space Hog meeting Shockwave adds nothing of substance to the ongoing story, and we don't need that scene to understand when he shows up in the actual Transformers comic shortly after. Jetfire was a pleasant surprise in issue 1 and probably helped bump up sales for this comic, but again, we don't need that context to understand him showing up in the other comic, and it doesn't add anything to this comic's plot. You can read Transformers without reading this or the G.I. Joe stuff. You can read the G.I. Joe stuff without reading Transformers or Void Rivals, but if one were to pick this up and you're not already a Transformers fan or reading the other books already, I just don't know if one could enjoy this or even understand what's happening half the time. I generally enjoy the connective tissue the other two IPs are having, but this comic feels preoccupied with the crossover aspects rather than benefiting from it. Okay, spoiler talk and theorizing over, time for final thoughts. Void Rivals is a comic I didn't expect to read or end up enjoying as much as I did. But hey, that's Kirkman for you. While it is enjoyable, I wouldn't call it the best the Energon Universe has to offer right now. I'd nestle it somewhere between Cobra Commander and Duke if I were to rank these. But hey, a firm 7 out of 10 isn't anything to be ashamed of by any means. I don't intend to read this month to month, but I'll keep picking up the trades at the very least. Looks like next issue we'll be getting a follow-up on the end of Cobra Commander, with Pythona showing up to be a nuisance, so that could be interesting. As for what's next for the Energon Universe, we'll be taking a look at Scarlet and Destro since those two are wrapping up pretty soon. Then we'll be revisiting Transformers and finally taking a look at the first arc of the ongoing G.I. Joe comic once that's had time to get some issues out. But that's all I got for right now. Thank you all for watching. This is Major Disaster signing off, and make sure to look away from your screen for at least 20 seconds to prevent eye strain.